Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, because my internet has been bad, we're not doing this as a live reading, but I'm just going to record it. This is Killing Hope by William Blum, the 2012 edition, I believe. And this is chapter 2, begins in the PDF copy on page 41. Chapter 2, Italy, 1947 and 1948. Free elections, Hollywood style. Begins with a quote. Those who do not believe in the ideology of the United States shall not be allowed to stay in the United States, declared the American Attorney General Tom Clark in January 1948. In March, the Justice Department, over which Clark presided, determined that Italians who did not believe in the ideology of the United States would not be allowed to emigrate to or even enter the United States. This was but one tactic in a remarkable American campaign to ensure that Italians who did not believe in the ideology of the United States would not be allowed to form a government of a differing ideology in Italy in their election of 1948. 2 years earlier, the Italian Communist Party, the PCI, one of the largest in the world, and the Socialist Party, PSI, had together gathered more votes and more seats in the Constituent Assembly election than the Christian Democrats. That was in 1946. But the two parties of the left had run separate candidates and thus had to be content with some ministerial posts in a coalition cabinet under a Christian Democrat premier. The results, nonetheless, spoke plainly enough to put the fear of Marx into the Truman administration. For the 1948 election, scheduled for April 18th, the PCI and the PSI united to form the Popular Democratic Front, FDP, and in February won municipal elections in Pescara with a 10% increase in their vote over 1946. The Christian Democrats ran a poor second. The prospect of the left winning control of the Italian government loomed larger than ever before. It was at this point that the U.S. began to train its big economic and political guns upon the Italian people. All the good old Yankee know-how, all the Madison Avenue savvy in the art of swaying public opinion, all the Hollywood razzmatazz would be brought to bear on the target market, quote unquote. Pressing domestic needs in Italy, such as agricultural and economic reform, the absence of which produced abysmal extremes of wealth and poverty, were not to be the issues of the day. The lines of battle would be drawn around the question of democracy, quote-unquote, versus, quote-unquote, communism, the idea of capitalism remaining discreetly to one side. But of course, capitalism is anyway synonymous with democracy in the American mind. The fact that the communists had been the single most active anti-fascist group in Italy during the war, undergoing ruthless persecution, while the Christian Democrat government of 1948 and other electoral opponents on the right were riddled through and through with collaborators, monarchists, and plain unreconstructed fascists. This too would be ignored, indeed turned around. It was now a matter of communist, quote-unquote, dictatorship versus their adversaries' quote, love of freedom. This was presumed a priori. As one example, a group of American congressmen visited Italy in summer of 1947 and casually and arbitrarily concluded that, quote, the country is under great pressure from within and without to veer to the left and adopt a totalitarian collective national organization. To make any of this at all credible, the whole picture had to be pushed and squeezed into the frame of the, quote, American way of life versus the Soviet way of life. A specious proposition which must have come as somewhat of a shock to leftists who regarded themselves as Italian and neither as Russian nor as American. In February 1948, after non-communist ministers in Czechoslovakia had boycotted cabinet meetings over a dispute concerning police hiring practices, the communist government dissolved the coalition cabinet and took sole power. That's in 1948. The Voice of America pointed to this event repeatedly as a warning to the Italian people of the fate awaiting them if Italy, quote-unquote, went communist. and used as well by anti-communists for decades afterwards as a prime example of communist duplicity. Yet, by all appearances, the Italian Christian Democrat government and the American government had conspired the previous year in an even more blatant usurpation of power. In January 1947, the Italian premier, Alcide de Gasperi, visited Washington at the United States invitation. His overriding concern was to plead for crucial financial assistance for his war-torn, impoverished country. American officials may have had a different priority. 3 days after returning to Italy, De Gasperi unexpectedly dissolved his cabinet, which included several communists and socialists. The press reported that many people in Italy believed that De Gasperi's his action was related to his visit to the United States and was aimed at decreasing leftist, principally communist influence in the government. After 2 weeks of torturous delay, the formation of a center or center-right government sought by De Gasperi proved infeasible. The new cabinet still included communists and socialists, although the left had lost key positions, notably the ministries of Foreign Affairs and Finance. From this point until May, when De Gasperi's deputy, Ivan Lombardo, led a mission to Washington to renew the request for aid, promised loans were frozen by the United States for reasons not very clear. On several occasions during this period, the Italian left asserted their belief that the aid was being held up pending the ouster of leftists from the cabinet. The New York Times was moved to note, "Some observers here feel that a further leftward swing in Italy would retard aid." As matters turned out, the day Lombardo arrived in Washington, De Gasperi again dissolved his entire cabinet and suggested that the new cabinet would manage without the benefit of leftist members. This indeed is what occurred, and over the ensuing few months, exceedingly generous American financial aid flowed into Italy, in addition to the cancellation of the nation's $1 billion debt to the United States. At the very same time, France, which was also heavily dependent upon American financial aid, ousted all its communist ministers as well. In this case, there was an immediate rationale: the refusal of the communist ministers to support Premier Ramadier in a vote of confidence over a wage freeze. Despite this, the ouster was regarded as a, quote, surprise and considered bold in France. An opinion was widespread that American loans were being used, or would be used, to force France to align with the U.S. Said Ramadier, "A little of our independence is departing from us with each loan we obtain." Here you see, this whole experience, it just gets repeated again and again and again, in country after country after country. Exactly the same formula of promising aid to a country on the basis of whether or not your government will be the government that we want, and whether the government that we want will consistently and comprehensively align itself with our priorities, with American interests, and with loyalty to America. If you do that, we will give you aid, and we'll even, as in Italy, we'll even cancel your debt. Because anyway, it doesn't matter. We can cancel your debt because we're doing nothing but get you in more and more debt with every passing day. So that's fine. We can cancel the debt of the past because there's no danger of you being debt-free. But it's interesting to note that they were doing this with their own so-called allies, their own so-called partners, their own so-called co-Westerners. That America, this is what I've said many, many times. There isn't a Western fraternity. There isn't a white fraternity. There isn't an Anglo-Saxon fraternity between the United States and anybody else. The United States is about the United States, and when I say that the United States is about the United States, or about the interests of the United States, their own interests, obviously I'm not talking about the national interests. I'm talking about the interests of the elite in that society. So when you see that in fact, it's nothing new for them to be aggressive and interventionist and bullying, even with their own kind, their own, as I say, co-Westerners in Italy and France. And we'll see throughout this book in other examples in Europe. You see, this isn't a new thing. And it's really remarkable that anyone believes that the United States actually has what you can really call allies. They don't have allies, they have subjects. So there's just a question of whether you're going to be an American subject or not. They don't have allies, they have either subjects or they have enemies. They have subjects or they have targets. Targets for destabilization and subjugation and subordination and so on. So if you're not going to be subordinate, then you're going to be subjugated. Continuing with the book. As the last month of the 1948 election campaign began, Time magazine pronounced the possible leftist victory in Italy to be the brink of collapse. Quote, "It was primarily this fear," William Colby, former director of the CIA, has written, "that had led to the formation of the Office of Policy Coordination, which gave the CIA the capability to undertake covert political propaganda and paramilitary operations in the first place." So the origin of this, the capacity of the CIA to engage in covert political propaganda and paramilitary operations was based on what was going on in Italy and the fear that Italy would elect a so-called leftist or pro-communist, pro-socialist government in 1948. They gave this power to their intelligence apparatus, the CIA, not for any genuine security threat, not on the basis of any genuine security threat to the United States whatsoever, but for purely ideological and economic reasons. Most importantly, economic, because the ideological reason is actually just sort of a packaging, and it's a cover-up, as I say, for the practical economic intentions that the U.S. had. Because here you have to understand, when they talk about, I've mentioned this before, when they talk about communism, and as the Italians here, the Italians didn't consider themselves to be pro-Russian or pro-American, they considered themselves to be pro-Italian. So that's what most so-called leftists and so-called communists and so-called socialists around the world, especially in the global south, that's what they actually meant when they use the term communist, or they use the term leftist, or they use the term socialist. What they really meant was pro our people. We don't want to be subjugated, neither by the Soviet Union nor by the United States. We want our own sovereignty. Now, I think that with the non-aligned movement, they came up with a better term to just say non-aligned. We want to have a non-aligned policy. But until then, you had these were the big ideologies that existed in the world, and you kind of had to choose one or the other. And one of them gave you more sovereignty than the other, which was so-called communism or so-called socialism. But it's important, I think, to distinguish or to differentiate when they were talking about communism, what they meant. What it meant to the common people was basically just support for the general public and a general control over your resources as a nation, and an improved quality of life for the people, and so on, and not being subjugated. Returning to the book. But covert operations, as far as is known, played a relatively minor role in the American campaign to break the back of the Italian left. It was the very overtness of the endeavor, without any apparent embarrassment, that stamps the whole thing with such uniqueness and arrogance. One might say swagger. The fortunes of the FDP slid downhill with surprising acceleration in the face of an awesome mobilization of resources, such as the following. The FDP, remember, was the main party that was created between the Italian communists and the Italian socialists. So he's saying that there was a mobilization of resources such as the following. A massive letter-writing campaign from Americans of Italian extraction to their relatives and friends in Italy, at first written by individuals in their own words or guided by quote-unquote sample letters in newspapers, soon expanded to mass-produced, pre-written, postage-paid form letters, cablegrams, educational circulars, and posters needing only an address and a signature, and from a group calling itself the Committee to Aid Democracy in Italy. 500,000 picture postcards illustrating the gruesome fate awaiting Italy if it voted for the, quote, dictatorship or foreign dictatorship. In all, an estimated 10 million pieces of mail were written and distributed by newspapers, radio stations, churches, the American Legion, wealthy individuals, etc. And business advertisements now included offers to send letters, airmail to Italy, even if you didn't buy the product. All of this with the publicly expressed approval of the acting Secretary of State and the Post Office, which inaugurated special quote-unquote freedom flights to give greater publicity to the dispatch of the mail to Italy, this propaganda mail. The form letters contained messages such as, quote, a communist victory would ruin Italy, the United States would withdraw aid, and a world war would probably result, unquote. Quote, we implore you not to throw our beautiful Italy into the arms of that cruel, despot communism. America hasn't anything against communism in Russia, but why impose it on other people, other lands, in that way putting out the torch of liberty? Quote, if the forces of true democracy should lose in the Italian election, the American government will not send any more money to Italy, and we won't send any more money to you, our relatives. Look at that. These were by no means the least sophisticated of the messages. Other themes emphasized were Russian domination of Italy, loss of religion and the church, loss of family life, loss of home and land, scaremongering, fear-mongering, telling you that if you voted for your own Italians, by the way, if you voted for your own co-citizens, your own compatriots in Italy, Italians, saying that if you voted for Italians, not foreigners, if you voted for Italians who were communist or who were socialist or who were even leftist, why then that's like becoming a part of the Soviet Union. You become part of a foreign dictatorship. But somehow, if you believe in the ideology of America, which they have said very specifically, that you won't even be allowed to come to the United States, you won't even be able to visit the United States if you don't believe in the ideology of America. Meaning, if you come from a country, why they were saying that was to ensure that the government in Italy would follow the ideology of the United States, so that you could come from Italy to the United States under the assumption that you are coming from coming from a country that believes in the same ideology as America. Whereas if you elected a leftist or socialist or communist government in Italy, then you would be treated as someone who does not believe in the ideology of America. So they're making it very ideological. They're the ones who are saying that your government has to follow our ideology, meaning basically you have to be under us. But they're projecting that and saying that if you, in Italy, if you elect a socialist, leftist, communist government or what have you, then you are under them. They're drawing the lines this way. They're the ones who are drawing the lines. The Italian communists themselves regarded themselves as Italians first, who are following an ideology that they genuinely believed was going to be the best for Italians. And again, as he mentioned earlier, these were the factions in Italy who fought the hardest against the fascists during the war, who fought the hardest against Mussolini in the war, and they were the ones that the Americans helped or used to help them to fight against the Italian fascists. But now you turn on them. They had already shown during the war that they were on the side of their own people, that they were on the side of their own nation against domination and tyranny under Mussolini. And now you're trying to accuse them of being themselves tyrants and aligning themselves with tyrants and trying to bring foreign domination over Italy. Meanwhile, America they themselves, Americans, the United States government, is telling you, you must follow our ideology or you will be treated as an enemy. So, I mean, who is the one who's actually trying to enforce their domination over someone else? And who's the one who's trying to impose foreign control over Italy. But you see how they do. They do it literally by threats, by using people's own family members, saying that you're going to go bankrupt, saying that we're not going to send you any money. Even your own family members won't send you money. You'll be disowned by your own family members. And everyone knows, especially at that time, back in those days, how important family was to Italians. Veteran newsman Howard K. Smith pointed out at the time that, quote, for an Italian peasant, a telegram from anywhere is a wondrous thing, and a cable from the terrestrial paradise of America is not lightly to be disregarded. Well, that's a bit pompous. The letters threatening to cut off gifts may have been equally intimidating. Such letters, wrote a Christian Democrat official in an Italian newspaper, struck home in southern Italy and in Sicilian villages with the force of lightning. A 1949 poll indicated that 16% of Italians claimed to have relatives in the United States with whom they were in touch. This apparently was in addition to the friends that they had in the United States. The State Department backed up the warnings in the letters by announcing that if the communists should win, there would be no further question of assistance from the United States. The Italian left felt compelled to regularly assure voters that this would not really happen. This, in turn, inspired American officials, including Secretary of State George Marshall, to repeat the threat. Marshall was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, by the way, in 1953, for threatening people with a suspension of aid if they didn't follow what America wanted them to follow and didn't elect a government that America approved of. That is what makes you eligible for assistance. That's what makes you eligible for aid. That's what makes you eligible, essentially, as a human being. A daily series of direct shortwave broadcasts to Italy, backed by the State Department and featuring prominent Americans, was undertaken. The State Department estimated that there were 1.2 million shortwave radio receivers in Italy as of 1946. Those probably would have spread throughout the country during the war. The Attorney General went on the air and assured the Italian people that the election was, quote, a choice between democracy and communism, between God and godlessness, between order and chaos. William Donovan, the wartime head of the OSS, which was the forerunner of the CIA, warned that, quote, under a communist dictatorship in Italy, many of the nation's industrial plants would be dismantled and shipped to Russia, and millions of Italy's workers would be deported to Russia for forced labor. If this were not enough to impress the Italian listeners, a parade of unknown but passionate refugees from Eastern Europe went before the microphone to recount horror stories of life behind, quote, the Iron Curtain. Several commercial radio stations broadcast to Italy special services held in American Catholic churches to pray for the Pope in, quote, this his most critical hour. On one station, during an entire week, hundreds of Italian Americans from all walks of life delivered 1-minute messages to Italy, which were relayed through the shortwave radio station. Station WOV in New York invited Italian war brides to transcribe a personal message to their families back home. The station then mailed the recordings to Italy. Voice of America daily broadcasts into Italy were sharply increased, highlighting news of American assistance or gestures of friendship to Italy. A sky full of showbiz stars, including Frank Sinatra and Gary Cooper, recorded a series of radio programs designed to win friends and influence the vote in Italy. 5 broadcasts of Italian-American housewives were aired, and Italian-Americans with some leftist credentials were also enlisted for the cause. Labor leader Luigi Antonini called upon Italians to, quote, smash the Muscovite fifth column, which follows the orders of the ferocious Moscow tyranny, or else Italy would become an enemy totalitarian country. To counter communist charges in Italy that Negroes in the United States were denied opportunities, that's black people, the VOA broadcast the story of a Negro couple who had made a fortune in the junk business and built a hospital for their people in Oklahoma City. It should be remembered that in 1948, American Negroes had not yet reached the state of second-class citizens, the status of second-class citizens. Italian radio stations carried a 1-hour show from Hollywood put on to raise money for orphans of Italian pilots who had died in the war. It was not reported if the same was done for the orphans of German pilots. Because remember, the Italians in the war, or pilots who died in the war, were pilots who were flying on the enemy side. They were the pilots who were shot down by Americans and British and so on, by the Allied forces. So they're saying that they did that. He's questioning. You're saying that you're doing that for the Italian pilots, or the orphans of Italian pilots, but you didn't do it for the orphans of German pilots, even though they were both fighting on the same side. American officials in Italy widely distributed leaflets extolling U.S. economic aid and staged exhibitions among low-income groups. The U.S. Information Service presented an exhibition on, quote, the worker in America, and made extensive use of documentary and feature films to sell the American way of life. It was estimated that in the period immediately preceding the election, more than 5 million Italians each week saw American documentaries. The 1939 Hollywood film Ninotchka, which satirized life in Russia, was singled out as a particularly effective feature film. It was shown throughout working-class areas, and the communists made several determined efforts to prevent its presentation. I'm sure that them trying to prevent it actually made people even more interested in watching it, and probably made people it probably actually gave the film even more credibility, because the communists were trying to ban it. You see how that works? When you react to something in that way, it just makes people think that you're trying to hide something. So they probably, by their attempt to prevent it, they probably actually made more people watch it. After the election, a pro-communist worker was reported as saying that what licked us was Ninotchka. In other words, what defeated us was Ninotchka. That film destroyed us. And I'm guessing, as I said, not only the film, but your own reaction to the film, the way that you dealt with it. You made people believe that that film was telling the truth, and you were trying to hide the truth. That's my commentary. The Justice Department served notice that Italians who joined the Communist Party would be denied the dream of so many Italians, which was to emigrate to America. The State Department then ruled that any Italians known to have voted for the communists would not be allowed to even enter the United States, the terrestrial paradise, he calls it. A department telegram to a New York Politico read, voting communist appears to constitute affiliation with the Communist Party within meaning of immigration law, and therefore would require exclusion from the United States. It was argued that this information be emphasized in letters to Italy. Now, how exactly they would know who you voted for is an open question. President Truman accused the Soviet Union of plotting the subjugation of Western Europe and called for universal military training in the United States and a resumption of military conscription to forestall, quote, threatened communist control and police state rule. During the campaign, American and British warships were frequently found anchored off Italian ports. Time, the magazine, in an edition widely displayed and commented upon in Italy shortly before the election, gave its approval to the sentiment that, quote, the U.S. should make it clear that it will use force if necessary to prevent Italy from going communist. In other words, the U.S. Should make it clear that they will use force if necessary to prevent the Italian voters from voting according to their own beliefs. The U.S. should make it clear that they will use force if necessary to control the outcome of the election in Italy. The U.S. should make it clear that they will use force if necessary to prevent democratic elections in Italy. The United States and Italy signed a 10-year treaty of friendship, commerce, and navigation. This was the first treaty of its kind entered into by the United States since the war, a point emphasized for Italian consumption. A quote-unquote friendship train toured the United States, gathering gifts, and then traveled around Italy distributing those gifts. The train was painted red, white, and blue, but of course it was. and bore large signs expressing the friendship of American citizens towards the people of Italy. Now, you don't want to go and lose that friendship, do you? By doing what you think is right for your own country? Because the only thing that is right for your country is being an American friend. The United States government stated that it favored Italian trusteeship over some of its former African colonies, such as Ethiopia and Libya, a wholly unrealistic proposal that could never come to pass in the post-war world. The Soviet Union also, by the way, made a similar proposal. In other words, you're just telling them things that they want to hear, not something that could ever actually happen. You're trying to create, in the Italian population, a sense of what they call in the stock market FOMO, a fear of missing out. That if you vote communist, if you don't vote for who America votes for, look at what you're going to lose out on. You're going to lose out on the opportunity to continue your colonial empire. You're going to miss out on the opportunity of all of these great gifts that America is giving you. You're going to miss out on the opportunity of potentially visiting or even emigrating to the United States. If you vote the wrong way, why, America is going to take away your whole future. The U.S., Great Britain, and France maneuvered the Soviet Union into vetoing for the third time a motion that Italy be admitted to the United Nations. The first time, the Russians had expressed their opposition on the grounds that a peace treaty with Italy had not been signed. After the signing in 1947, they said that they would accept the proposal if other World War II enemies, such as Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania, were also made members. So in other words, the Russians had opposed Italy being admitted as a member of the United Nations because there had been no peace treaty with Italy. Then when the treaty had been signed, they said that they still opposed letting Italy into the United Nations because Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania were not also being invited to become members of the United Nations. And they vetoed it because they thought that was unfair and partial. The same three allied nations proposed to the Soviet Union that negotiations take place with a view to returning Trieste to Italy, formerly the principal Italian port on the Adriatic coast bordering Yugoslavia. Trieste had been made a quote-unquote free city under the terms of the peace treaty. The approval of the Soviet Union was necessary to alter the treaty, and the Western proposal was designed to put the Soviets on the spot, to put the Russians on the spot. The Italian people had an intense sentimental attachment to Trieste, and if the Russians rejected the proposal, it could seriously embarrass the Italian communists. A Soviet acceptance, however, would antagonize their Yugoslav allies. The U.S. prodded the Russians for a response, but none was forthcoming. From the Soviet point of view, the most obvious and safest path to follow would have been to delay their answer until after the election, yet they chose to announce their rejection of the proposal only 5 days before the vote, thus hammering another nail into the FDP coffin. And again, I'll just repeat, the FDP was the sort of leftist coalition party that included the so-called communists and the so-called socialists, Italians. A, quote, manifesto of peace to freedom-loving Italians, unquote, calling upon them to reject communism, was sent to Premier de Gasperi. Its signatories included 2 former U.S. Secretaries of State, a former Assistant Secretary of State, a former Attorney General, a former Supreme Court Justice, a former Governor of New York, the former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt herself, and many other prominent personages. This message was presumably suitably publicized throughout Italy, a task which was made easy in the extreme, in so much as an estimated 82% of Italian newspapers were in the hands of those unsympathetic to the leftist bloc. More than 200 American labor leaders of Italian origin held a conference, out of which came a cable sent to 23 daily newspapers throughout Italy, similarly urging thumbs down on the Reds. At the same time, the Italian American Labor Council contributed $50,000 to anti-communist labor organizations in Italy. The CIA was already secretly subsidizing such trade unions to counteract the influence of leftist unions. But this was standard agency practice, independent of electoral considerations. According to a former CIA officer, when in 1945 the communists came very near to gaining control of labor unions, first in Sicily, then in all of Italy and southern France, cooperation between the OSS and the Mafia successfully stemmed the tide. In other words, the forerunner to the CIA, the OSS, collaborated with the Mafia to undermine leftist influence in trade unions in Italy and in southern France. The CIA, by its own later admission, gave $1 million to Italian, quote, center parties, a king's ransom in Italy in 1948, although another report places the figure at $10 million. The agency also forged documents and letters purported to come from the PCI, the Italian Communist Party, which were designed to put the party in a bad light and discredit its leaders. Anonymous books and magazine articles funded by the CIA told in vivid detail about supposed communist activities in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Pamphlets dealt with PCI candidates' sex and personal lives, as well as smearing them with the fascist and or anti-church brush. So here you see the CIA was putting out propaganda to slander the character of particular candidates from the Italian Communist Party, detailing personal scandalous stories about them and so forth. This is, again, something that they use all the time. An American group featuring noted Italian-American musicians traveled to Rome to present a series of concerts. President Truman chose a month before the election as the time to transfer 29 merchant ships to the Italian government as a, quote, gesture of friendship and confidence in a democratic Italy. These were Italian vessels that were seized during the war, and others to replace those seized and lost. These were what was returned to Italy, or what was sent to Italy, were Italian vessels that were seized during the war. And then there were others that were sent along with that were to replace Italian vessels that were seized and lost during the war. 4 days later, the House Appropriations Committee acted swiftly to approve $18.7 million in additional interim aid funds to Italy. 2 weeks later, the United States gave Italy $4.3 million, which was the first payment on wages due to 60,000 former Italian war prisoners in the U.S. who had worked, quote-unquote, voluntarily in the Allied cause. This was a revision of the peace treaty, which stipulated that the Italian government was liable for such payments. 6 days before the election, the State Department made it public that Italy would soon receive $31 million in gold in return for gold looted by the Nazis. The fact that only a few years earlier Italy had been the quote-unquote enemy fighting alongside the Nazis was now but a dim memory. Water under the bridge. 2 days later, the U.S. government authorized 2 further large shipments of food to Italy, one for $8 million worth of grains. A number of the aid ships, upon their arrival in Italy during the election campaign, had been unloaded amid ceremony and a speech by the American ambassador. A poster prominent in Italy at the time read, "The bread that we eat, 40% Italian flour, 60% American flour, sent free of charge." The poster neglected to mention whether the savings were passed on to the consumer or served to line the pockets of the baking companies. 4 days before the election, the American Commission for the Restoration of Italian Monuments announced an additional series of grants to the Italian Ministry of Fine Arts. April 15th was designated Free Italy Day by the American sympathizers for a free Italy, with nationwide observances to be held. The American ambassador, James Clement Dunn, traveled constantly throughout Italy, pointing out to the population on every possible occasion what American aid had meant to them and their country. At the last unloading of food, Dunn declared that the American people were saving Italy from starvation, from chaos, and possible domination from outside. The irony. You are literally emphasizing right now how you are dominating Italy from outside, and saying that you dominating Italy from outside is saving them, rescuing them from being dominated from outside. His speeches usually received wide coverage in the non-left press. By contrast, the Italian government prohibited several of its own ambassadors abroad from returning home to campaign for the FDP. In his historic speech of March the 12th, 1947, which came to be known as the Truman Doctrine, President Harry Truman proclaimed, "I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free people to work out their own destinies in their own way." He might have added, as long as that way is our way. It scarcely needs to be emphasized how hypocritical this promise proved to be. But the voices which spoke out in the United States against their government's crusades in Italy were few and barely audible above the roar. The Italian-American Committee for Free Elections in Italy held a rally to denounce the propaganda blitz, declaring that, quote, "thousands of Americans of Italian origin feel deeply humiliated by the continuous flow of suggestions, advice, and pressure being put on Italians as though they were unable to decide for themselves who to elect." The Progressive Party also went on record stating, "As Americans, we repudiate our government's threat to cut off food from Italy unless the election results please us. Hungry children must not go unfed because their parents do not vote as ordered from abroad." The party's candidate for president in 1948 was Henry Wallace, the former vice president who was an outspoken advocate of genuine détente with the Soviet Union. History did not provide the opportunity to observe what the reaction would have been amongst those who saw nothing wrong with what the United States was doing in Italy if a similar campaign had been launched by the Soviet Union or by the Italian left in the United States on behalf of Wallace. Think about that. This is always a good exercise. Whenever you see the Americans doing something, whenever you see the U.S. doing something abroad, and the statements that they make abroad, and the activities that they're engaged in, and the type of influence and the interference that they engage in abroad, just ask yourself, could the country that they're interfering in do the same thing in the United States and have it be similarly applauded and act and presented as if it was good and righteous and freedom-loving and democratic and so forth? No, America, look, any suggestion of Soviet interference in the elections, any suggestion of Chinese interference in American elections, of Iranian interference in American elections, and by interference they actually just mean, even though there hasn't been much actual evidence of it, what they actually just mean is, for example, social media posts, promoting posts on Facebook or other social media platforms that support this candidate against that candidate, if the origin of those posts is coming from abroad. Well, look at what the United States does. They don't do anything but that, and it's far more than social media posts. I mean, just look at what they did in Italy. It's an absolute avalanche of propaganda, of funding, of bribing, of threatening, of extortion to try to get the result that they wanted. Why, if any country had tried to do that in the United States, it would have been even when they weren't doing it. It was they pretended that the communists were trying to take over America, that the Soviet Union was trying to take over America, that anyone who was a communist or a leftist or a socialist in America was a Soviet agent trying to undermine and subvert the country and take over the country, even if they had no connection whatsoever to the Soviet Union. They still treated that like it was foreign interference and foreign agitation, foreign instigation to try to rise up and overthrow the government and impose a communist regime in the United States, even when they weren't doing infinitesimal fraction of what America was doing openly, overtly, and covertly in Italy. Though some Italians must have been convinced at times that Stalin himself was the FDP's principal candidate, the actual Soviet intervention in the election hardly merited a single headline. The American press engaged in speculation that the Russians were pouring substantial sums of money into the Communist Party's coffers. However, a survey carried out by the Italian Bureau of the United Press revealed that the anti-communist parties spent 7.5 times as much money as the FDP on all forms of propaganda. The Christian Democrats alone spending 4 times as much as the FDP. As for other Soviet actions, Howard K. Smith presented this observation. The Russians tried to respond with a few feeble gestures for a while. Some Italian war prisoners were released. Some newsprint was sent to Italy and offered to all parties for their campaign. In other words, just blank newsprint for you to print your own materials on. But there was no way of resisting. But there was no way of resisting what amounted to a tidal wave of American propaganda. There is evidence that the Russians found the show getting too rough for them and actually became apprehensive of what the Americans and the British reaction to a communist victory at the polls might be. Russia's concern about conflict with the West was also expressed within a month of the Italian elections in one of the celebrated Cominform letters to Tito, accusing the Yugoslavs of trying to involve the Soviets with the Western powers when it should have been known that the USSR, after such a heavy war, could not start a new one. The evidence Smith was alluding to was the Soviet rejection of the Trieste proposal. But by its timing, reported the New York Times, quote, the unexpected procedure caused some observers to conclude that the Russians had thrown the Italian Communist Party overboard. The party's newspaper had a difficult time dealing with the story. Washington did as well, for it undermined the fundamental premise of the Italian campaign that the Italian Communist Party and the Soviet Union were indistinguishable as to ends and means, but if you buy the one, you get the other as well. Thus, the suggestion was put forth that perhaps the Soviet rejection was only a tactic to demonstrate that the United States could not keep its promise on Trieste. But the Soviet announcement had not been accompanied by any such propaganda message, and it would not explain why the Russians had waited several weeks until near the crucial end to deliver its body blow to their Italian comrades. In any event, the United States could only come out smelling a lot sweeter than the Russians. The idea here is that the decision that the Soviets made with regards to Trieste was potentially them actually throwing the Italian Communist Party under the bus because they were afraid of exactly what the Americans might do if Italy actually did elect a communist government. When the Broadway show had ended its engagement in Italy, the Christian Democrats stood as the clear winner with 48% of the vote. The leftist coalition had been humiliated with a total unexpected polling of but 31%. It had been a crusade of the kind which Aniran Bevin had ascribed to the Tories. The whole art of conservative politics in the 20th century, the British Labour leader wrote, is being deployed to enable wealth, to persuade poverty, to use its political freedom to keep wealth in power. And that's the end of chapter 2. I hope that he will go on. I think that he does, because he deals with different decades. As you see, this was just 1 year in the history of Italy, when Italy was subjected to a massive avalanche of propaganda and intervention and interference by the Americans. That's just 1 year. So I hope that he will continue in later chapters, I believe he does, to talk about other examples of American interference and covert operations in Italy, because they have been involved in Italian politics for a very, very long time, and they never got out of it, as a matter of fact. From just post-war to Operation Gladio to even the Berlusconi years, and even Mario Draghi. They've never not been involved in Italian politics and making sure that they can maintain control over the Italian government and what their policies will be, which has increasingly been more determined by financial institutions like the IMF. And they've increasingly used, because back in 1948, the IMF didn't have that much power. It existed, but it didn't have the same kind of power that it does now, and it hadn't completely formed its sort of ethos, its policy ethos around neoliberalism hadn't been completely solidified as yet. But those institutions have been used maybe more than anything else to control the politics in Italy, and to make sure that even Draghi himself was a former European Central Bank director. So they've always tried to keep Italy under their thumb, and what they meant in 1948 is what they are more openly doing now, which is that it doesn't have anything to do with democracy and the American way of life. It has to do with really neoliberal politics, neoliberal economic policies. What became known as neoliberal economic policies, which again is just another name for the subjugation of an economy to foreign private sector powers. So, okay, that's the end of chapter 2. We're now going to be starting on page 50 for the next reading, inshallah, and that will begin to talk about Greece, 1947 to the early 1950s, from cradle of democracy to client state. And I hope, inshallah, we can do that with a live reading, inshallah, maybe tonight or tomorrow. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.